Good traveler, welcome to this quiet corner of the realm. We thank thee for stopping by and sharing this moment of rest with us. May thy worries fade, thy breath grow slow, and thy sleep be deep and peaceful this night. Now close thine eyes, and let the story carry thee away. Chapter 17. The Urban Child's Work. Shops and Streets. But what if you weren't born in a village, surrounded by fields? What if your childhood unfolded on the cobblestone streets of a medieval town or city? The setting changed, but the fundamental principle remained the same. Your small body had economic value, and that value would be extracted from sunrise to sunset. The urban child's work was just as relentless, but it came with a different set of dangers and a much louder, more chaotic backdrop. Your options were slightly more varied than your rural cousins, but no less demanding. If your family ran a shop, a baker, a butcher, a candle maker, you were born into the business. Your first memories would be the smells of the trade and the sound of the shop bell. As soon as you could walk, you'd be given simple tasks: sweeping the floor, fetching ingredients from the market, or, most commonly, minding the front counter. You were the shop assistant, expected to handle customers, make change, and watch for thieves, all while being barely tall enough to see over the counter. There was no training manual. You learned by watching, by making mistakes, and by getting yelled at until you got it right. The shop was your home, your school, and your prison. If your family didn't have a trade, you'd be sent out into the streets to find work. You could become a messenger, running errands for merchants or officials, navigating the labyrinthine alleys of the town. You could be a street vendor, hawking small goods like pies or ribbons from a tray hung around your neck. These jobs offered a little more freedom of movement than being stuck in a shop, but they came with their own perils. The streets were crowded, filthy, and lawless. You were a small, vulnerable target for larger bullies, pickpockets, and the ever-present danger of being trampled by a cart or horse. Your pay was meager, often just a few coins or a scrap of food, and every penny was expected to be brought home to contribute to the family's survival. For the slightly more fortunate, the path of apprenticeship in a city workshop was the goal. But as we've discussed, this was no picnic. An apprentice in an urban craft guild, a weaver, a metal worker, a tailor, started at the very bottom. Your first years were not about learning a noble craft. They were about being the master's domestic servant. You'd be stirring dye vats, sweeping up metal shavings, preparing raw materials, and running endless errands. The workshop itself was a dangerous place, filled with open flames, sharp tools, and toxic chemicals. There were no safety regulations. A moment of distraction could mean a serious burn, a lost finger, or a lungful of poisonous fumes. The master's priority was output, not your well-being. You were a cheap, disposable source of labor, and your safety was your own concern. So whether you were trapped behind a counter, running through crowded streets, or toiling in a noisy workshop, the urban child's life was a constant negotiation with danger. The threats were less about the slow hunger of a failed harvest and more about the immediate, violent accidents of a crowded, industrializing world. Your childhood was spent not in open fields, but in the shadow of towering buildings, your ears ringing with the clamor of commerce, your small body just another piece of moving inventory in the great, grinding machine of the medieval city. The setting was different, but the outcome was identical. Your labor was your life, and your childhood was merely the brief, unpaid internship for a lifetime of work. Chapter 18. The girl's specific burden. Domestic preparation. And if the general workload was heavy for every child, for a girl, the path was even more narrowly defined, and the preparation began even earlier. From the moment you could understand words, you were being groomed for one primary destiny: marriage and the management of a household. Your childhood wasn't a time of exploration. It was a highly specialized training program for a life of domestic servitude. While a boy might have a handful of potential futures, farmer, soldier, apprentice to various trades, your options were starkly limited. Your value was almost entirely tied to your future role as a wife and mother, and your education was a relentless, practical drill for that single outcome. This training kicked into high gear around the age of 7, that same magical age of reason that marked the start of apprenticeship for boys. But your apprenticeship was to your own mother. Your classroom was the home, and your curriculum was the endless cycle of tasks required to keep a family alive. You learned to cook not as an art, but as a survival skill. You'd stand by the hearth, stirring the family's pottage, learning exactly how much grain to add, how to tell when it was done, how to stretch a meager portion of meat to feed a half-dozen people. There was no room for experimentation. A failed meal wasn't a disappointment. It was a minor catastrophe. You learned textile work with an intensity that boys were spared. Spinning, weaving, sewing, and mending were not optional hobbies. They were fundamental economic activities. The entire family's clothing, its bedding, its linens, all of it passed through your hands. You'd start with simple tasks like carding wool, preparing the fibers for spinning. Then you'd graduate to the drop spindle, spending hours each day turning raw fluff into usable thread. Your skill with a needle was a direct measure of your future value. A girl who could sew a straight, strong seam was a better marriage prospect than one who couldn't, because she would keep her future family clothed and presentable. Your fingers were rarely still. There was always a garment to mend, a piece of cloth to hem, and crucially, you were trained in childcare from a very young age. As the eldest daughter, you were often a second mother to your younger siblings. You'd be responsible for watching them, feeding them, and keeping them out of trouble while your mother attended to other work. This wasn't play. It was an apprenticeship in motherhood itself. You learned to change swaddling clothes, to soothe a crying infant, to recognize the signs of common childhood illnesses. This practical experience was considered essential because your primary function in adulthood would be to produce and raise the next generation of laborers. Your own childhood was truncated so you could begin training for the childhoods you would one day oversee. The ultimate goal of all this preparation was your marriage, which was often arranged for practical, economic reasons while you were still in your mid-teens. Your father would negotiate a marriage contract, a business deal that exchanged your labor and fertility for a dowry or an alliance with another family. Your feelings in the matter were rarely considered. Your childhood training was about maximizing your value in this marketplace. A girl who was hardworking, skilled in domestic arts, and healthy was a valuable asset. Your entire upbringing was a calculated investment, designed to ensure you could run a household efficiently, bear children successfully, and be a credit to your husband's family. The burden was specific, heavy, and left very little room for anything that we would recognize as a carefree youth. You were being molded into a cornerstone of the domestic economy, and the molding process began almost as soon as you could walk. Chapter 19. Health and Hygiene. Theory versus reality. So you're working from dawn till dusk, you're eating a meager diet, and you're constantly surrounded by people and animals. How did you stay healthy? The short, brutal answer is, you didn't. The medieval understanding of health and hygiene was a bizarre mix of sophisticated theory and utterly useless, often harmful, practical reality. The medical theory of the day, inherited from the ancient Greeks, was based on the concept of the four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Health was a state of perfect balance between these fluids. Sickness meant an imbalance. It was an elegant, logical system that was completely wrong. A fever wasn't your body fighting an infection. It was an excess of blood. A cough wasn't a respiratory issue. It was an excess of phlegm. So the cures were designed to rebalance these imaginary fluids, often by making the patient much, much worse. And what about hygiene? The theory said cleanliness was important, but the reality of daily life made it nearly impossible. The idea of germ theory was 1,000 years in the future. No one understood that invisible organisms caused disease. They thought sickness was caused by bad smells, or miasma, or an imbalance of those humors. So while a medieval person might have wanted to be clean, the practical means were scarce. Bathing was an occasional event, not a daily ritual. For the wealthy, it might involve a wooden tub brought into the chamber. For everyone else, it was a quick splash in a river or a basin of water, and even that water was often contaminated. Soap, when it was available, was a harsh, gritty substance made from animal fat and ash. It did the job, but it was hardly a gentle, scented experience. Your skin was likely always slightly grimy, your hair often lice-ridden. Your home environment, as we've discussed, was a petri dish. Dirt floors, thatched roofs crawling with insects, animals living inches away, and human waste often disposed of just outside the door. You breathed this air. You slept in this filth. The idea of disinfecting a surface was alien. The hygiene you practiced was about managing the overwhelming smell and grime, not about preventing disease. You might scatter sweet-smelling herbs like lavender on the floor to mask odors, but you wouldn't understand that the real danger was in the water you drank or the food you handled with unwashed hands. It was a world where the very things meant to keep you alive, your home, your food, your water, were constantly working to make you sick. The gap between the elegant medical theory and the brutal, filthy reality of daily life was a chasm that millions of children fell into, never to climb out. Chapter 20. When you got sick. Folk remedies and prayer. So, given all that, what happened when you inevitably got sick? When the fever spiked, or the cough wouldn't stop, or the mysterious rash appeared? The answer is a descent into a world of desperation, where practical folk remedies blended seamlessly with pure, fervent prayer. There were no doctors for the vast majority of people, and even if there were, their scientific methods, like bloodletting, were often more dangerous than the disease itself. Your first line of defense was the collective wisdom of your mother or grandmother, a repository of herbal knowledge passed down through generations. These remedies were a mix of the potentially helpful and the utterly bizarre, all based on trial and error over centuries. For a fever, you might be given a tea made from willow bark, which we now know contains a precursor to aspirin. For a cough, a poultice of honey and herbs might be applied to your chest. But just as often, the cure was superstition. A wart might be treated by rubbing it with a stolen piece of meat and then burying the meat, in the belief that as the meat rotted, the wart would disappear. A headache might be treated by tying a special stone to your forehead. These remedies were administered with absolute seriousness. They were the only hope your family had, and the placebo effect, the simple power of believing you were being cared for, was probably the most effective ingredient in any of them. But when the illness was serious, when the herbal teas and poultices failed to break the fever, the response shifted from the physical to the spiritual. This is when prayer became the primary treatment. Your family would turn to the saints, specifically those known for healing. Saint Blaise was invoked for throat ailments. Saint Roch was the patron against plague. Your parents would pray. They might light a candle at the local church if they could afford it, and they would pray over you, anointing you with holy water or oil. The line between medicine and miracle was invisible. A healing charm whispered over a wound was as valid as a clean bandage. This wasn't a lack of caring. It was the logical endpoint of a world where disease was seen as a punishment from God or an attack by demonic forces. Fighting it required spiritual weapons, and if things got truly dire, the ultimate resort was pilgrimage. If a child was gravely ill, a parent might make a vow to a distant shrine, to Canterbury, to Walsingham, to any place known for miracles. They would travel, often on foot, to pray for your life at the feet of a saint's relics. The journey itself was an act of penance and faith, a desperate bargain with the divine. Spare my child, and I will prove my devotion. You, the sick child, would be left at home, fading in and out of consciousness, while your fate was being negotiated at a shrine miles away. The helplessness was absolute. There was no understanding of infection, no antibiotics, no real way to fight back. Your survival came down to the strength of your own constitution, the random effectiveness of a folk remedy, and the perceived willingness of a saint to intercede on your behalf. Getting sick wasn't a temporary inconvenience. It was a spiritual and physical crisis that you were statistically unlikely to survive. Chapter 21. Accidents. The constant danger of daily life. So you've survived illness, but your body faced another, more immediate threat every single day. Accidents. In a world without safety standards, where every tool was sharp, every fire was open, and every floor was uneven, your childhood was an obstacle course of potential disasters. The modern concept of child-proofing a home would have been laughable. Your entire environment was proofed against nothing, least of all you. Consider the agricultural world. You worked with tools that were essentially small versions of adult implements. A sickle for cutting grain had a blade sharp enough to slice through a stalk with one swing. A misstep, a moment of childish clumsiness, and you could easily sever a tendon or worse. The animals you tended weren't docile pets. A cow could kick, a pig could bite, a horse could spook and trample you. A simple fall from a haystack or a tree you were climbing to fetch fruit could mean a broken bone. And a broken bone, without proper setting or care, could lead to a permanent disability or a fatal infection. The fields and barns were a playground of sharp edges and heavy, unpredictable creatures. Inside the home, the dangers were just as prevalent. The hearth was the center of domestic life, a constantly burning open flame. You cooked over it, you warmed yourself by it, and your clothes dried near it. It took only a second for a loose sleeve to catch fire. Scalding water from the cooking pot could be spilled. The floor was often just packed earth or rough-hewn planks, full of tripping hazards. And the lighting was terrible, just a few rushlights or a single candle casting long, dancing shadows. In that dim, flickering light, it was easy to misjudge a step or bump into something sharp. Many of the ailments recorded as childhood diseases in parish records were almost certainly untreated injuries. Burns, cuts that turned septic, head wounds from falls. There were no safety precautions. No one was watching you to make sure you didn't run with a stick. There were no guardrails, no safety latches, no soft corners. Your safety was a secondary concern to your utility. An accident wasn't seen as a preventable tragedy. It was seen as an unfortunate, but inevitable, part of life. If you got hurt, the response was the same as for sickness: a poultice, a prayer, and hope. Your survival depended not just on avoiding disease, but on a daily, minute-by-minute negotiation with a physical world that was utterly indifferent to your fragility. Every task you performed, no matter how small, carried with it the quiet, constant risk of serious injury. Your childhood was a tightrope walk over a pit of potential catastrophe, and you were given no safety net. Chapter 22. The Social Hierarchy. Where you stood, and through all of this, the labor, the danger, the sickness, your entire experience was filtered through one unchangeable fact: your place in the rigid social hierarchy. Medieval society was a pyramid, and where you were born on the pyramid determined everything about your childhood, from your chances of survival to the very texture of your daily life. You weren't just a child. You were a peasant child, or a noble child, or an urban merchant's child. That label came with a pre-written script for your entire youth. If you were born a peasant, which the overwhelming majority of children were, your fate was essentially sealed. Your childhood, as we've detailed, was a direct apprenticeship for a life of agricultural labor. Your value was your ability to work the land. Your horizons were the boundaries of your village. Your future was a carbon copy of your parents' lives. There was no social mobility to speak of. You were born into a station of life, and you were expected to die in it. The church taught that this was God's plan, that each person had their divinely ordained place. For you, that place was at the bottom, and your childhood was a brutal conditioning to accept that reality. Your suffering was, in a twisted way, a sign of your piety, your acceptance of your lot in life. The social hierarchy wasn't an abstract concept. It was the fence that kept you in your field. For the tiny minority born into the nobility, your childhood was a different kind of pressure cooker. Your survival odds were slightly better, thanks to better food and slightly less squalid living conditions. But you paid for that privilege with a complete lack of freedom. Your childhood was not your own. It was a political asset. Your marriage was likely arranged when you were still a toddler, a strategic alliance to cement your family's power. Your education was focused on leadership, warfare, and courtly manners, the skills needed to rule, not to labor. But perhaps the most striking difference was emotional. You were often raised not by your parents, but by servants and tutors. Your mother might be busy managing the estate or producing more heirs. Your father was off fighting or at court. Your primary caregivers were paid staff. You lived in a castle, but you might have experienced more loneliness than the peasant child sleeping in a one-room hut with their entire family. And then there was the urban merchant class, a relatively new group emerging in the later Middle Ages. If you were their child, you occupied a strange middle ground. You weren't bound to the land like a peasant, but you lacked the inherited titles of the nobility. Your value was in business acumen. Your childhood was an apprenticeship in commerce, learning to read, write, and do sums, skills that were useless to a peasant but essential for a merchant. You had a glimpse of social mobility. A successful merchant family could, over generations, buy land and marry into the lower nobility. So your upbringing was infused with a sense of potential advancement, a pressure to succeed and elevate the family name. Your world was the bustling, competitive environment of the town, a world of contracts and profits rather than harvests and feudal dues. Your childhood was a calculated investment in a future that was, for the first time, not entirely predetermined by your birth. Chapter 23. Special Cases, Orphans and the Destitute. But within this rigid social pyramid, there was one group of children who stood on the very edge, who had fallen through the cracks entirely. The orphans and the utterly destitute. If the life of a child with a family was harsh, the life of a child without one was a precarious dance on the brink of annihilation. Your vulnerability was absolute. You had no father to offer legal protection, no mother to administer folk remedies, no family unit to provide even the meager safety net of shared labor and a spot by the fire. You were adrift in a world that had no systems designed to catch you. Your fate depended entirely on the charity of others, and that charity was patchy, unreliable, and often came with strings attached. The first line of defense was the parish. The local church was supposed to provide for the deserving poor, and orphan children certainly fit that category. This might mean a few pennies from a charitable fund, or a place in a parish-sponsored almshouse if you were very lucky. But these resources were always stretched thin. There was no welfare state, no guaranteed support. Your survival hinged on the generosity of your neighbors, who were often struggling to feed their own children. You might become a beggar, relying on the Christian duty of almsgiving to scrape together enough food to avoid starvation. Your life was a daily plea for mercy. For some, particularly very young children, the monastery or convent became a refuge. A religious house might take in an orphan, especially if a small property or donation came with you. But this wasn't adoption in the modern sense. You were being given to God. Your childhood would be spent within the stone walls of the cloister, your days governed by the monastic rule. For a boy, this could mean an education, learning to read and write Latin, a path to a stable, if celibate, life. For a girl, it was a similar confinement. It was safety, but it was safety purchased with your entire future and your freedom. You exchanged the uncertainty of the outside world for the rigid, unchanging rhythm of religious life. And the cold, hard statistics tell the final, grim part of the story. Mortality rates for orphaned and destitute children were astronomically higher than for those with families. Without consistent nutrition, without anyone to care for you when you got sick, without the basic protection of a roof that was yours, your chances of seeing adulthood plummeted. The records of foundling hospitals, where unwanted infants could be left anonymously, are some of the most heartbreaking documents from the period. The survival rates were abysmal. For these children, the medieval world offered little more than a brief, painful interval between birth and death. They were the ultimate special case, the starkest illustration of a society where childhood itself was a luxury that required a family to afford it. Your existence was a testament to the fragility of life and the limits of medieval compassion, a quiet tragedy playing out in the shadows of every village and town. Chapter 24. Coming of age. The end of childhood. So after years of labor, loss, and navigating a world of constant danger, how did it all end? When did your childhood officially finish? The answer is that there was no bright line, no single birthday party or graduation ceremony. Your childhood didn't end. It just faded away, absorbed into the grinding responsibilities of adulthood. The transition was vague, practical, and often brutally swift. For most, the shift was marked by your capacity for full, adult labor. There was no legal age of majority that applied to everyone. You were considered ready for marriage or the full responsibilities of your trade when you were physically capable of doing the work. For a peasant boy, this might be around 14, when you could handle a full-size plow or swing a scythe alongside the men. For a girl, it was when you could competently manage all the tasks of running a household. Your body, not a number on a calendar, was the measure of your readiness. This timeline was heavily influenced by inheritance patterns and the stark economic pressures of survival. A father might need to retire from heavy labor and pass the family plot to his son. A daughter might be married off in her mid-teens to form an advantageous alliance, or to reduce the number of mouths her family had to feed. Your coming of age was less about personal development and more about the cold calculus of the household economy. There was no concept of adolescence, no extended period of self-discovery. One day you were a child laborer, and the next you were just a laborer, with all the burdens of providing for a family now squarely on your own shoulders. Your youth wasn't a phase to be cherished. It was an obstacle to be overcome as quickly as possible so you could get on with the serious business of survival. The end of childhood wasn't a celebration. It was a promotion to a harder, more permanent state of toil. Chapter 25. The noble child's different world. So we've painted a pretty grim picture of childhood for 90% of the population. But what about the top? What was life like for the noble child, the son or daughter of a lord or a knight? Surely they had it easy, right? A castle, servants, plenty of food. Well, yes and no. Their world was different, but it was a different kind of pressure cooker. Their survival odds were slightly better, but their childhood was traded for a different currency. Duty, politics, and a complete lack of personal freedom from the moment they could walk. First, the good news. Your chances of surviving past the age of 5 were significantly higher than your peasant counterparts. You were born into a stone castle or manor house, not a drafty hut. You had access to more varied and plentiful food. You slept in a proper bed, probably in your own room, or at least shared only with siblings, not the entire family and the livestock. When you got sick, a physician might actually be summoned, though as we know, that was often a mixed blessing. The physical comforts were undeniably better, but this safety came at a steep price. Your life was not your own. You were a political pawn from birth. Your marriage was almost certainly arranged as a toddler, a business deal to secure an alliance, expand land holdings, or settle a feud. Your feelings were irrelevant. You were an asset on your father's balance sheet, and your childhood was the brief period before you were deployed for strategic advantage. Your education was also completely different. While peasant children learned by doing manual labor, your education was focused on the skills of leadership and warfare. A noble boy would be taught to read and write, often in Latin or French, the languages of law and court, but book learning was secondary to physical training. You'd be schooled in horsemanship, swordsmanship, and archery from a very young age. Your play was practice for war. Toy swords were replaced with real, blunted practice weapons as soon as you were strong enough to lift them. Your childhood was a military academy, preparing you to lead men into battle and defend your family's estate. For a noble girl, the education was just as purposeful. You learned to manage a large household, to oversee servants, to do fine embroidery, and to behave with the impeccable manners required at court. Your entire upbringing was designed to make you an ornament and a capable manager, a credit to your future husband's high status. And perhaps the most profound difference was emotional. While a peasant child slept in a crowded, smelly hut, they were surrounded by family. A noble child, however, was often raised at a distance. The common practice of fostering meant you might be sent away to another noble household to be raised. This was meant to build political alliances and teach you courtly ways. Your primary caregivers were nurses, tutors, and servants. Your parents were often distant figures, busy with the administration of their lands or attending the king's court. You lived in a castle, but you could experience a deep loneliness and a lack of the chaotic, intimate affection that even the poorest child might know. Your comfort was purchased with emotional distance. Your value was in your bloodline and your training, not in your laughter or your childish whims. So yes, the noble child's world was different. There was less fear of starvation, but more fear of disappointing your family's ambitions. Chapter 26. The Emotional Landscape, Affection and Distance. Now, this leads to the most haunting question of all. Did they love you? Did your parents, your family, feel the same fierce, protective affection that defines modern parenthood? The historical debate on this is fierce and often uncomfortable, because the evidence is so contradictory. Parish records show parents grieving, writing poignant entries for lost children. Yet everything about the structure of their lives seemed designed to create emotional distance. The truth is probably not a simple yes or no, but something much more complex and alien to our modern sensibilities. Affection existed. Of course it did. The human heart hasn't changed. Parents gave their children pet names. They carved little wooden toys for them. The church even warned against spoiling children with too much affection. But this love operated under a constant, crushing shadow. The statistical likelihood that you would die. How do you invest your entire heart in a small life that has, by the numbers, a 1 in 3 chance of not seeing its 5th birthday? The response, for many, was a kind of pragmatic, emotional reserve. It wasn't a lack of love. It was a defense mechanism against constant, soul-crushing loss. You might not name a newborn for a few weeks, until it seemed likely to survive. You might not get too attached. This wasn't cruelty. It was a brutal form of emotional survival in a world drenched in mortality. This distance was also reinforced by the practical realities of life. Your value was primarily economic. You were a pair of hands, a future laborer. Sentimentality was a luxury that a struggling peasant family could ill afford. Your father's primary concern was whether you could work the fields. Your mother's was whether you could manage a household. Demonstrative affection, the kind of coddling we associate with childhood, was rare. Your upbringing was about building resilience, not nurturing sensitivity. A child who cried too easily was a liability. A child who couldn't bear hardship was a child who wouldn't survive. So love was often expressed not through hugs and kisses, but through the relentless, grinding work of keeping you alive. The food they scraped together, patched clothes, the meager shelter. It was a love expressed through survival, not sentiment, and this created a profound paradox. In the crowded, one-room hut, you were never physically alone. You slept pressed against your siblings, your parents. You worked side by side all day. There was a constant, overwhelming physical proximity. But emotionally, there could be a vast distance, a wall built from the need to endure the unendurable. Your parents had seen too many children die. They had to harden their hearts just to get through the day. So the emotional landscape of a medieval childhood was a strange terrain. Intense physical closeness existing alongside a deep, unspoken emotional reserve. You were surrounded by family, yet you might have experienced a loneliness that a modern child, with their own bedroom but a parent's undivided attention, would never understand. It was a world where love was real, but it was often a quiet, practical, and heartbreakingly cautious kind of love. Chapter 27. Stories and Songs. The oral tradition. But in this world of relentless work and quiet emotional distance, where did you find joy? Where was the light? For most children, it wasn't in objects or possessions, but in the air itself, in the stories and songs passed down through the oral tradition. This was your entertainment, your education, and your connection to a world beyond your village. There were no books for you, no written stories designed for a child's mind. Your library was the memory of your elders, and your cinema was the half-fire on a rare, quiet evening. The stories you heard weren't gentle fairy tales. They were often dark, moralistic fables designed to teach a lesson or explain the mysterious world around you. You'd hear tales of clever animals outwitting stronger foes, which mirrored the peasant's own struggle against powerful lords. You'd hear local legends about ghosts in the woods or spirits in the river, which served as a warning to stay close to home and avoid danger. These stories were a form of social programming, teaching you the values of your community, obedience, cleverness, and the importance of knowing your place. The line between a story and a cautionary tale was razor thin. A tale about a child who wandered too far and was taken by the forest folk was just as much a public safety announcement as it was entertainment. And then there were the songs. Music wasn't something you listened to. It was something you participated in. Work songs helped coordinate labor in the fields, their rhythm making the back-breaking toil slightly more bearable. Ballads told epic stories of heroes and battles, of love and loss, preserving the community's history long before it was ever written down. You learned these songs by osmosis, humming the tunes as you worked, the words becoming part of you. They were memory aids, a way to pass down information from generation to generation. A song about the proper way to sow crops was as valuable as any agricultural manual. This oral culture was the backdrop of your entire childhood. It was how you learned your place in the world, how you understood the changing seasons, and how you connected with the generations that came before you. There was no such thing as children's literature. The very concept of crafting a story specifically for a child's innocent enjoyment didn't exist. Every story, every song, had a practical purpose wrapped in a thin layer of wonder. Your imagination was fed, but it was fed a diet of harsh realities and practical lessons. Your play was the stories you retold to your siblings, the songs you sang while you worked. It was a flickering, fragile light in the long, dark tunnel of your medieval youth, but it was a light nonetheless. Chapter 28. The Church Year. Structure and Festival. So your daily life was a relentless cycle of labor, but your yearly life, the rhythm of the entire calendar, was structured by something else entirely. The church. The liturgical year wasn't just about religion. It was the master clock for the entire community. It gave shape to the endless grind, carving out moments of rest, celebration, and collective meaning. For you, as a child, this calendar was more real and more important than the seasons of planting and harvest. It told you when to work, when to feast, and when to fear. The year was punctuated by a series of holy days, which is where we get our word holiday. And these weren't just a day off. They were intense, communal experiences that broke the monotony. Christmas wasn't a single day of presents. It was the 12 days of Christmas, a prolonged period of feasting and revelry that stood in stark contrast to the Advent fast that came before it. Easter was the culmination of Lent, a 40-day period of fasting and penance where you gave up meat, dairy, and eggs. As a child, those 40 days must have felt like an eternity of bland pottage and hunger, making the Easter feast an explosion of flavor and relief. These cycles of deprivation and celebration were a physical, tangible lesson in the core Christian themes of sacrifice and redemption. You didn't just hear about it in a sermon. You felt it in your stomach. And these festivals were a fascinating blend of the sacred and the deeply pagan. The Church, in its wisdom, often built its holy days right on top of older, pre-Christian festivals. The Christmas season coincided with the winter solstice, a time of ancient feasting to drive back the darkness. Easter was tied to the spring equinox and fertility rites. May Day, with its dancing around the maypole, a pretty obvious fertility symbol, was tolerated by the Church as a harmless folk custom. For you, this didn't matter. It was all just part of the tradition. The year was a tapestry woven with threads of Christian doctrine and much older, earthier magic. The saints' days for your local patron saint became a village-wide party, a chance to forget your troubles, drink ale, watch mystery plays performed by the guilds, and simply be part of a loud, joyous crowd. The Church was the undeniable center of this life, the physical and spiritual heart of the village. Chapter 29. Weather and Shelter. The elements as enemy. But your biggest enemy, the one you could never escape, wasn't illness or injury or even your master's wrath. It was the weather. The elements themselves were in a constant, silent war against your fragile body, and your only defense was a shelter that offered little more than symbolic protection. You weren't just living in the Middle Ages. You were living outside. Your home was a porous barrier against a world that was often brutally cold, perpetually damp, and utterly indifferent to your survival. Think about winter. Forget central heating. Forget insulated walls. Your home, if you were lucky, had a central hearth. The heat from that fire didn't travel. It just rose straight up into the rafters, leaving the floor and the corners of the room freezing cold. The walls were thin, often just wattle and daub, a lattice of sticks smeared with mud and straw. The wind didn't knock. It just came right on in, whistling through 1,000 tiny cracks. At night, the fire was banked to embers to prevent the entire thatched roof from going up in flames, and the temperature inside could plummet to near freezing. You slept in whatever clothes you had, huddled together with your entire family for shared body heat, your breath fogging in the air. Waking up with a layer of frost on your blanket inside your own home was not a rare occurrence. The cold was a physical presence, a third occupant in the room that slowly leached the warmth and life from you. And the cold brought its partner, the damp. That charming thatched roof, it leaked, constantly. In a heavy rain, water would find its way through, dripping into pots placed strategically on the dirt floor, which would then turn to mud. The walls wicked moisture from the ground. Everything you owned felt slightly damp, slightly clammy. Your clothes never truly dried out. Your bedding developed a persistent, musty smell. This constant, low-level dampness was a breeding ground for respiratory illnesses, the coughs and lung infections that were among the top killers of children. Your shelter wasn't keeping the elements out. It was just barely slowing them down, forcing you into a daily, losing battle against the chill and the wet that seeped into your very bones. The luxury of a dry, warm bed was a fantasy you couldn't even conceive of. Chapter 30. Travel and Mobility. The village is your universe, so with your entire world defined by the church spire and the boundaries of the fields, how far did you actually go? What lay beyond the edge of your village? For the vast majority of medieval children, the answer was simple. Nothing, or rather, nothing that you would ever see. Your universe was your village, its surrounding fields, and maybe the next village over if you were lucky. The world beyond was a place of rumor, legend, and terrifying uncertainty. Your horizons weren't just limited, they were practically non-existent. Think about it. There were no family vacations, no school trips. Your entire life was lived within a radius of maybe 10 miles. You knew every tree, every stream, every family in your parish. That was it. Travel was difficult, expensive, and dangerous. The roads were little more than muddy tracks, often impassable in winter. Bandits were a real threat. For a peasant family, there was simply no reason to go anywhere. Your life, your work, your entire social world was right here. To travel was to leave behind your safety net, to venture into a landscape where you had no rights and no protection. For you, as a child, the idea of seeing a city, or a mountain, or the sea was as fantastical as dreaming of flying. Your mental map of the world was a small, intensely detailed circle, surrounded by a vast, blank space labeled, "Here be dragons." This had a profound psychological impact. Your identity was entirely local. You were from this specific village, with its specific customs and its specific dialect. Someone from a village 20 miles away might as well have been from a foreign country. Their accent would be strange, their ways unfamiliar. Your sense of the world was incredibly small and incredibly deep. You knew the legends of your local haunted mill, the story behind the oddly shaped rock in the field, the history of every family for generations. But you knew nothing of kings or popes except as distant, almost mythical figures. Your world was immediate, tangible, and very, very small. The concept of a nation or a country was an abstract idea preached by the priest. Your real country was the land your father farmed. The one exception to this rule, the one glimpse you might get of a wider world, was pilgrimage. If your family was particularly devout, or if they were desperate for a miracle, they might undertake a pilgrimage to a nearby shrine. This was the only form of long-distance travel that was socially acceptable and spiritually sanctioned. For you, this would have been the adventure of a lifetime. Walking for days, sleeping in roadside inns or church porches, seeing different landscapes, meeting people from other regions. It was a sensory overload. But even this was rare. Most pilgrimages were local. The truly long journeys to Canterbury or Rome or even Jerusalem were for the wealthy, the nobility, or the truly desperate. For you, the child of a peasant, your world was your village. It was your entire universe, and you were destined to live and die within its narrow, familiar confines. Your life a small, intense drama played out on a very, very small stage. Chapter 31. Crime and Victimization. The vulnerable target, and within your small, confined world, you were the easiest target. Your lack of physical strength, your limited legal rights, and your inherent trust made you a magnet for predation. The concept of a crime specifically against a child barely existed. You were just a softer, more vulnerable version of a person, and the world was full of people willing to take advantage. You had little to steal, but what you did have could be taken, the bread you were carrying, the few coins you were sent to market with. But more than theft, your greatest risk was violence and exploitation. As an apprentice, you were legally bound to your master, who had the right to discipline you, a line that was easily crossed into outright abuse with no one to intervene. On the streets, you were vulnerable to assault. The justice system offered you little protection. Your word carried less weight than an adult's, and your father or master would have to press any charges on your behalf, which they often wouldn't bother to do for a simple beating. Your vulnerability was just a fact of life, another danger to be endured, another reason to stick close to home and hope you weren't singled out by someone bigger and crueler than you. Chapter 32. The Black Death. Childhood in catastrophe. But all of these daily struggles, the grinding poverty, the constant threat of disease, they were just the background music of medieval life. Then, in the middle of the 14th century, the music stopped. The Black Death arrived, and the world you knew, for all its hardship, simply ended. This wasn't just another wave of sickness. It was a geological event, an extinction-level catastrophe that reshaped the very fabric of society. And for a child, it was the ultimate, terrifying test of survival in a world where all the rules had been torn up. Imagine it. The rumors would have arrived first. Whispers of a great mortality sweeping through towns to the east, killing everyone in its path. Then, the first cases in your own village. The speed was incomprehensible. Someone would be healthy in the morning, develop a fever by noon, show the terrifying black buboes in their armpits and groin by evening, and be dead within days. There was no hiding from it. The disease didn't care if you were a noble in a castle or a peasant in a hut. Your family, your friends, your entire support system began to vanish overnight. The adults who were supposed to protect you were dying faster than they could be buried. The church bells, which once marked the hours of your life, now tolled ceaselessly for the dead, until even the bell ringers succumbed and the villages fell into an eerie, horrifying silence. Your childhood, already a precarious existence, was now a waking nightmare of abandonment and terror. The normal structures of society collapsed completely. Fields went untended because there was no one left to tend them. Laws became meaningless. Priests died hearing last rites. Doctors died attempting useless cures. Lords died in their manor houses. You were left alone, or with a handful of other terrified survivors, in a world of corpses. If your parents died, which was statistically likely, you became one of countless orphans wandering the countryside, searching for food and shelter that no longer existed. The scale of the loss is almost impossible to grasp. Historians estimate it killed between 30 to 50% of Europe's entire population in just a few years. For you, that meant there was a coin flip chance that every single person you knew was just gone. The psychological trauma on your generation was absolute. You witnessed the complete and utter failure of the adult world to keep you safe. You saw death on a scale that defied understanding, and in the grim, strange aftermath, something shifted. With so many dead, those who survived, and you were one of the tough, lucky, or cursed few, suddenly had value. Labor became scarce. A child who could work, who had survived the worst the world could throw at them, was now an asset. Wages for laborers actually rose because there were so few people left to do the work. The rigid feudal system, which had kept your family tied to the land for generations, began to crack under the weight of all those empty tenements. For the first time, you might have had a sliver of bargaining power, a tiny bit of leverage in a world that had previously seen you as disposable. But it was a hollow victory, paid for with the lives of everyone you had ever loved. Your survival came at the cost of your entire world. The Black Death didn't just kill people. Chapter 33. Jewish and Muslim Children. Minority experiences. But the story of medieval childhood isn't a single story. For the vast majority, the backdrop was the Christian church. But what if your family prayed in a different direction? What if you were a Jewish or Muslim child growing up in a world that saw your very existence as a problem to be managed, or worse, threat to be eliminated? Your childhood came with all the standard medieval hardships, the disease, the labor, the danger, But it also came with an extra, invisible layer of pressure, the constant, looming threat of persecution simply for who you were. Your identity wasn't just a fact, it was a liability. Your daily life was shaped by a precarious balance between isolation and integration. In many places, Jewish communities were forced to live in specific quarters, what would later be called ghettos. This wasn't by choice. It was often mandated by law. For you, this meant your world was even smaller and more tightly knit than that of a Christian peasant. You lived, played, and went to school entirely within a few city blocks, surrounded by people who shared your faith, your customs, and your language. This created an incredibly strong, protective community. Your education was paramount, focused intensely on religious texts and law. For a Jewish boy, learning to read Hebrew and study the Torah wasn't just an academic exercise. It was the core of your identity and your future role within the community. Your childhood was a rigorous preparation for a life lived within these walls, a life where intellectual and spiritual strength were your primary defenses against a hostile outside world. But that outside world was always there, pressing in. The threat of violence was a constant, low-grade hum in the background that could erupt into a scream at any moment. You were taught, from a very young age, to be cautious around Christians. You learned the stories of pogroms and expulsions in other towns, whispered warnings about what could happen if the local lord needed a scapegoat for a plague or a fire. The blood libel myth, the utterly false accusation that Jews kidnapped and murdered Christian children for rituals, was a particularly terrifying specter that could turn your neighbors into a murderous mob overnight. Your childhood innocence was sacrificed early to the need for hypervigilance. Your play was confined. Your movements were watched. Your safety depended on the fragile protection of a local noble, protection that could be withdrawn the moment it became politically or financially inconvenient. For Muslim children, particularly those living under Christian rule in places like Spain after the Reconquista or in the Crusader states, the experience was similarly fraught. You were part of a conquered people, a subject population. Your family might have been allowed to practice their faith in relative peace, but they did so as second-class citizens, paying special taxes for the privilege. Your world was one of cultural tension. You might speak Arabic at home and the local Romance language in the streets. You navigated two sets of customs, two calendars, two worlds. The pressure to convert, to assimilate and escape the legal and social disabilities was immense. Your childhood was a daily lesson in code switching and survival, in maintaining your dignity and identity in a world that systematically devalued both. Chapter 34. The Material World. Few possessions, many dangers. So in this world of constant toil and invisible threats, what did you actually own? What were the physical objects that filled your small, confined universe? The answer is almost nothing. The concept of personal possessions, especially for a child, was a luxury that simply didn't exist. Your world was one of stark material scarcity, where even the simplest item was hard-won, carefully maintained, and fraught with hidden dangers that a modern child would never see coming. Think about your room. You didn't have one. Think about your toys. You might have a single, crudely carved wooden animal, or more likely, just a stick and a stone that your imagination transformed into a knight and a dragon. Your possessions weren't things you owned for fun. They were things you used for survival. Your bowl, your spoon, the clothes on your back. These weren't just objects. They were essential tools. A cracked bowl was a minor disaster. A torn tunic meant hours of mending by candlelight. You learned from infancy to treat every single item with care, because replacing it was a significant expense, a drain on your family's meager resources. There was no such thing as disposable anything. Everything was repaired, repurposed, and used until it literally fell apart. This scarcity bred a deep, ingrained respect for the material world that is completely alien to our culture of abundance. And this world of few possessions was also a world of constant, unseen danger. The objects you used every day were lethal by modern standards. The family cooking pot over the open hearth was a tipping hazard that could scald you with boiling pottage. The farming tools leaning against the wall of your one-room home had sharp, unguarded edges. There were no safety caps, no child-proof loss, no soft corners on the furniture. The floor was often just packed earth, hard and unforgiving. The stairs to the loft, if you had one, were little more than a ladder. Your home wasn't a sanctuary. It was a minefield of potential accidents. What we would call childproofing was an unimaginable concept. Your safety was your own responsibility, learned through the harsh lessons of bumps, burns, and cuts. You grew up fast because you had to. A moment's inattention could mean a broken bone, a terrible burn, or worse. Chapter 35. The End of the Day. Exhaustion, not relaxation. So the sun finally sets. The light fades from the sky. For a modern child, this is the cue for winding down. Maybe a bath, a bedtime story being tucked in. For you, none of that. The end of your day wasn't marked by a pleasant routine. It was marked by a single, overwhelming sensation. Pure, unadulterated exhaustion. Your body simply gave out. You didn't decide to go to sleep. Sleep ambushed you. There was no concept of relaxation. That's a modern luxury. The idea of having free time in the evening to just sit and do nothing was incomprehensible. The work only stopped when it became too dark to see. Your final tasks were done by the dim, flickering light of a tallow candle or the embers of the hearth, mending a tool, finishing a bit of spinning, preparing something for the next morning's pre-dawn start. There was no leisure, no entertainment, no quiet conversation, just the final, grim chores before your body surrendered. You didn't have a bedtime. You had a point of collapse. And when you finally did sleep, it wasn't the gentle, restorative sleep we know. It was a coma of fatigue. You slept where you fell, in the clothes you'd worked in all day, on a scratchy straw mattress or just a pile of rags on the floor, surrounded by the snores and shuffles of your entire family. There were no peaceful dreams of flying or fantasy. Your dreams were likely just faint, distorted echoes of your waking life, the rhythmic motion of scything, the fear of a looming storm, the gnawing hunger in your belly. You woke up not feeling refreshed, but merely less exhausted than you were the night before, your muscles still aching, ready to be pushed to their limit all over again. Your day didn't end. It just paused for a few hours of unconsciousness before the grind began again at first light. The end of your day wasn't a transition to peace. It was just the brief, necessary shutdown of a body that had been used up. Chapter 36. The Legacy. How medieval childhood shaped adulthood, so you survived. Against all the odds, the disease, the accidents, the hunger, the grinding labor, you made it to adulthood. But what kind of adult did this forge? The childhood we've just walked through wasn't just a difficult phase to be endured. It was a brutal conditioning program that fundamentally shaped the medieval mind and the structure of their entire society. The person you became was the direct, unvarnished product of everything you'd endured. The most immediate legacy was a profound, almost unimaginable resilience. Your entire childhood was a masterclass in enduring hardship without complaint. You learned to accept pain, discomfort, and loss as the default state of existence. A modern adult might be derailed by a bad day at the office or a delayed train. For you, a bad day meant watching your sibling die of a fever or seeing your family's entire harvest wiped out by a hailstorm. Your threshold for what constituted a crisis was set astronomically high. This forged a psychological toughness, a stoic acceptance of suffering that is completely foreign to our modern, comfort-oriented worldview. You didn't expect life to be fair, or easy, or safe. You expected it to be a struggle, and you were rarely disappointed. This wasn't pessimism. It was the clearest-eyed realism, beaten into you by daily experience. This led directly to a worldview utterly devoid of the sentimentality we attach to childhood. You didn't look back on your early years with nostalgia. There were no fond memories of carefree play or parental coddling. Your childhood was a period of vulnerability and powerlessness that you were likely glad to have survived. As a parent yourself, you would not seek to give your own children a happy childhood in our sense of the phrase. Your goal was to make them tough, useful, and obedient, to prepare them for the same brutal world you had navigated. Affection was quiet and practical. The goal was survival, not happiness. This lack of sentimentality extended to everything. Death was a constant, familiar presence, not a hidden taboo. Relationships were often transactional, based on economic necessity. The modern idea of following your passion or finding your true self would have been seen as a bizarre, laughable luxury. And this meant you assumed adult responsibilities with a matter-of-factness that would shock us today. There was no extended adolescence, no period of exploration and self-discovery. You went from being a small, dependent child to being a small, productive adult almost overnight. A boy was expected to do a man's work in the fields by his early teens. A girl was prepared for marriage and running a household from the age of 7. There was no time for existential angst. Your identity was conferred by your labor and your social role. You were a baker, a farmer, a wife, a mother. That was your entire identity. The relentless, early assumption of responsibility created adults who were pragmatists above all else. Your decision-making was based on immediate, tangible needs. Will this action feed my family? Will it keep a roof over our heads? The abstract, the theoretical, the emotional, these were indulgences that had no place in the daily calculus of survival. Conclusion: raising a glass to the survivors. So the next time you tuck a child into a warm, safe bed, or watch them play in a clean, protected park, take a moment. Remember the countless children who never knew that safety, who worked until they collapsed, and for whom survival itself was the greatest achievement. Their toughness, forged in that brutal world, is the unspoken foundation for much of our modern comfort. Raise a glass to the survivors. We owe them a debt we can never repay.